New data from the Office for National Statistics showing that in England and Wales last year, for the first time since records began, unmarried women gave birth to the majority of babies. So we're talking about how society's changed. We've heard from Anne Keane about the pain of having her child forcibly removed because she was unmarried. Now, 2 generations on, it's the norm for a mother to be unmarried, whether that's as a cohabiting relationship, a single mother. We want to hear your experiences on the programme as well of family life outside of marriage. Yeah, let's speak to Rita Gupta now, who's a family lawyer, and also Jo Hemmings, who's a relationship expert as well. Jo, morning. We're seeing the family dynamic change. Just tell us what you've seen and how this is affecting people's relationships and the way we interact with each other, Jo.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it doesn't surprise me that the statistics have come out today saying that more children are born to unmarried mothers. I've seen a lot of change in my relationship counselling. I mean, firstly, weddings are massively expensive now. Secondly, they cause a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. I feel the joy has gone out of getting married for a lot of people because of those 2 factors. So the statistics don't surprise me, but what I see more and more are people adapting, if you like, to blended families. Obviously, as a psychologist and a relationship counsellor, a lot of couples who are now in situations where, the blended family, all the children have come together. How do they cope? I mean, I think we have to accept we are moving on, and it's a positive thing. We're going in a very positive direction in terms of family dynamics and accepting and understanding and appreciating those changes, which have come quite swiftly, particularly listening to some of your earlier callers and the awful things that they went through so many years ago. I feel that stigma, we're losing it fast, and that's a really good thing.
So positive changes, losing that stigma. But from a legal point of view, Rita, is that the case?
Unfortunately, the law hasn't caught up with a changing society. Totally agree with everything that Jo has said. Having done this job for 20 plus years, I've noted more and more cohabiting couples. And even if parties have got married and gone on to get married, they've cohabited often for quite a period of time before that. But unfortunately, the law doesn't give cohabiting couples the same level of protection that it does married couples. And it's a policy decision almost. It's always been very difficult to uphold the sanctity of marriage, perhaps, and at the same time provide cohabiting couples. And I think the biggest message I'd give is there's no such thing as a common law spouse. There is this common misconception that I'm somebody's common law wife or common law husband. That concept doesn't exist in law.
So what sort of protections are we talking about here?
Well, obviously, if you have children, you know that you can apply for child maintenance. There's also provisions that you can apply for under the Children Act, but they are quite expensive, time-consuming litigation. But the reality is that when you go into a cohabiting relationship, nobody goes into any relationship expecting it to end. And that's usually built on trust. You build a home together. But things like the ownership of property or assets in one person's name, they're not going to be up for division the way that they are if you were married. So the big thing that I would say is that if, say, for example, you're moving in with somebody or buying a property, you do need to take some advice. And I appreciate that's not very romantic and nobody really wants to go and do it. But I think you do need to take advice as to how property is owned, maybe looking at things like trust deeds or even cohabitation agreements, just to set things out from the outset as to what the parties' intentions are and to give some protection in case a relationship isn't an enduring one.
Is that one of the tensions, Jo, that can come into relationships, just figuring out the legal details and who would get what in the case of a divorce or a breakup?
I think so, because what you have to do, and it's very difficult for couples who are moving in together with all the hope in the world and the joy, that they actually have to look at the legal side of it if it doesn't work out. It sort of feels like prenup territory, that kind of legalese that you don't want to anticipate your relationship will ever end. But I mean, the advice is absolutely right. I mean, just step away from the romantic side and just be pragmatic. It's really important because the law, absolutely right, has not caught up. And that's your thing. You just need to bear in mind that it's lagged behind, as it so often does in cultural, sociological changes. It just isn't there. So you've got to beat that system and recognise what you have to do.
And I think what's really an area that I think particularly needs to be looked at is if you're a woman, you've had a child within that enduring relationship, you've stepped back from your career, you are the more vulnerable party. And I think if that relationship ends,
Yes.
there isn't the financial protection that there is to the extent the way you were married. If you've had that career break, or you would only be able to work part-time, or there's then the crushing costs of childcare. So a lot needs to be thought about, which unfortunately, most people don't address. I know similarly, family money often comes into it. People got a deposit from an inheritance or their parents, preserving that with a declaration of trust and maybe giving people a period of time on how they would divide things or, sell houses after or if the relationship broke down is all a very wise thing to do. But I appreciate not the most romantic thing to do. And people are very, find it an awkward conversation to raise.
It's so funny that you talk about this, Rita. I'll tell you why. Because that was kind of how I convinced my wife to marry me, because we were... She's very logical, right? And just didn't see the point in it. And then I had to bring up but look at all the benefits we're going to get and listed them. And then she's like, yeah, I think you're right, actually. So it's more the practical side of things that convinced her in that sense. I want to bring Alicia in Manchester in on this conversation, because Alicia, you can't see the point of marriage, can you?
No.
Listening to Jo and Rita here, has it changed your mind at all?
No, it hasn't. I've done a little bit of research on that. And what is important for me is that if anything happens to either of us, either me or my partner, I think everything that he owns goes to my child. So I just feel like as long as my child is protected, in such case, then it's fine. And you see, we discussed everything before we decided to have a child. We paid for the childcare 50-50. We both work full time, and we just try to communicate, because obviously there's, a lot on with a baby and full time work. But we just make sure we talk about it and just try to balance it all out.
Yeah, it's a good plan. You've clearly had that communication and got everything down, which is important. But Jo, is there anything that you would add to that?
Well, I think, that's sort of getting around the law, isn't it? To make sure that you have done something to protect yourself. And Alicia clearly has. I think where we're in the danger zone is where we've got an archaic law and people don't really care. They move in together. And I think it's a really good point about things like deposits on properties when you break up and it's acrimonious. That's when it gets worse. You have a very amicable breakup. You can sort it out between you. But if it's not amicable, and you have to go down the legal route, people are in real trouble. So I would always say to couples, do that homework. Make sure in some way, whether you get married or not, that you put something in place to protect yourselves, just in case, God forbid, you do break up. It's really important.
Rita, I think I just heard you wanted to jump in and say something to Alicia there.
I think, Elise is obviously somebody who has thought about things very carefully, and they've had candid, open discussions together. But many couples don't do that. They skate around subjects, or it's slightly awkward, so they don't want to discuss the fact that actually somebody put 20,000 or 50,000 more into a property. So I think if you've got an open, honest communication, then that's a positive thing. If you've done the research, then that's a very positive thing. But I would say the majority probably don't think about things as carefully, and that's where problems do arise, because when these cohabiting relationships end, or if there's a dispute about property, they're very messy disputes and they're very expensive disputes to deal with. So, getting early advice and thinking about things and having these communications, is the right thing to do. But the law needs to catch up. Our family law organisation Resolution has been campaigning for years to make sure that cohabiting couples get the protection that married couples do get. And that has to be obviously after a period of it being an enduring relationship, not after you've moved in with someone for a month. But, there are some people who have been cohabiting and their relationships are much longer than married couples.
Thank you so much to Rita Gupta, who's a family lawyer, who's been saying that the law needs to catch up with the way modern families are set up these days.